Welcome back. Now that we've successfully created our first external table and managed to query from the external table, let's talk about how to handle invalid records. It's not uncommon in data projects to receive a file with a handful of invalid records. So we should be able to handle those invalid records rather than having the query to fail. So let's first define what an invalid record is. In this example, it could be that you've received a record with a location ID of not being an integer, but because we have defined the location ID integer, if you receive that column with a date or a string, it's going to fail. And also it could be that actually your burrow turned up to be more than 15 characters long. Even if you had one of those records in this file, your select statement would fail. But in circumstances, if you can't trust the data and if you are expecting some invalid records, you probably want to handle them. So for example, you might want to say that I want to accept up to 10 invalid records, and if there are more than 10, I want the query to fail. Otherwise, I want to write away the 10 invalid records into another file and carry on with the processing. So that's what the reject options helps us with. Let me quickly switch over to the documentation and talk it through that. And as you can see here, reject options goes within the with clause of the create external table command, and that takes the 4 parameters specified here. Amongst these, the reject sample value at the moment is not used, that's there for future proofing. At the moment, there is no use for that within this table Synapse SQL. So let me scroll down and show you a couple of other things. So as we said before, parser version 1.0 has got additional functionality, but the 2.0 parser version performs better. So you need to take a call if you expect a file, which is huge, and you want to have better performance, you need to go for the version 2.0. Otherwise, in case you're getting a file, which is expected to have a few rejected records and you want to handle and you don't want your query to fail, you want to go for the parser version 2.0 and you can apply the reject options as well. So in terms of the parameters there, reject type at the moment, the value supported is value and percentage. Value is the default for reject option. So you have to specify value or percentage. You can just optionally leave that one out. And the reject value here has to be an integer. And this is where you specify how many records you want to reject before you want your query to fail. So for example, if you want to allow up to 10 invalid records, you would specify 10 and then you carry on. At the moment, it takes the values between 0 and about 2 billion, and you can write the rejected rows to allocation. So you specify allocation within your data source. As you know, we created a data source. We can write the rejection into that data source container and we will specify the folder path and the file names. And it follows the standard for the name of the folder here. As you can see, you get a folder with the date at the beginning and then you've got the statement ID so you can easily locate which statement caused the rejected records there, and also you'll get a JSON, which will have the errors that caused the issue as well. So that's pretty good in terms of investigating and finding out problems. But please be mindful that actually it's only supported in parser version 1.0, and I'd say it's only available for delimited text files. So let's now switch over to the Synapse Studio and apply the rejections to our external table. The first thing we want to do is to create another external file format to have the parser version 1.0. If you remember, we created the CSV file format here with the parser version 2.0, but we need the 1.0 to deal with rejections. So let's do that. First, I'm going to switch over to the Developer Hub and open the script here, and let me copy that and then make the corresponding changes. So I'm going to call this one with the suffix of v1 to represent parser version 1. And I'm going to change the parser version to 1.0 from 2.0. So that's all we need to do. I could simply select this and run it. But generally in production scenarios, you want to have your scripts to be rerunnable at the moment. If you just click on run here for the entire script, it's going to fail, saying this file format already exists. So what you can do is you can query this test tables to see whether the object already exists before creating it, if it exists. You don't create it. So I'm going to just do that here. I'm going to say if not exists, and then I'm going to query the tables here. So that this table you want to query here would be the system external file formats. And they can look for the name. And I'm going to say brand name equals, and then that will be the name here. So basically what happens is the clear statement will only run if that file format doesn't exist in our database. So I'm going to do the same here. So this will be rerunnable as well. And let's just move that forward. And here it should be called _pv1. And now if we run the script as a whole, it'll create this file format. But here actually it'll do nothing because the file format already exists. Let's try that. And that's happened. Let's switch over to the Data Hub and go to Workspace. And now if you click on the external resources and refresh, you should be able to see both of the file format. So you've got the CSV file format and the PV1 file format as well. While we're talking about this, let's do a similar change to our data source as well so that that's rerunnable as well. The only difference here is you'll have to look at this table called the external data sources for the data source name. So I'm going to just do that. So now the script is also rerunnable. I can just run it and actually do nothing because the data source already exists. I know it's a bit of a deviation from the lesson, but I thought it's important to teach you this so that you can write production-ready scripts. So let's now go back to our external table creation script and apply the changes to handle rejections. So we saw 4 parameters for the rejections, and we set out those. The reject type has a default value of value, and we don't need to specify that we don't need to reject sample value and that is currently not being used. So the only ones we wanted to put in are reject value and the rejected raw location. So let's do that. So the first one is the reject value, and I'm going to go with the value of 10 here as we discussed previously, and let's specify the rejected row location. And here we need to specify a location where we want to write our rejected records and the reason for the rejection. Again, it uses the same data source to be specified here, which is the NYC taxi SRC. And if you remember, that takes us to this container here. But within the container we need to decide where to put the data so we can put the rejected request within the raw folder as well. But we wouldn't want to just write them straight there. We want to probably create another folder called rejections, and then we can put the data there. But it would be totally up to you, and you'll have to make the decision based on your project requirements. But I'm going to put it under the raw folder, and I'm going to create another folder called rejections. And then I'll put the files in there. So let's do that. Let me go back to the script, and I'm going to have rejections. And then we'll have a folder for the table name as well so that we can see which file caused the issues. So that will be the rejections folder. And under that you're going to have the taxi zones, and then you will have any rejected records written there. And the last thing we want to do is to change the external file format. So since we want to use the parser version 1 here, so which is the copy file format and this copy 1, and that's everything for this script. So if I run this one, it's going to fail. That's because actually the table already exists. So we handle the external file format and the data source by not clearing them if they already exist. But in this case, we want to drop this table and we create it. But you need to remember that actually, when you are dropping a table, an external table, it's not going to drop the data and the data stays as it is. It's just the metadata over it. So we can simply drop the table and recreate it without affecting the data. So that's what we are going to do in a lot of languages. You will get the option to drop the table in the same command. So it'll be like drop table affect this, and then you can do the table name. Even SQL Server supports this. But unfortunately, the serverless SQL pool or the dedicated SQL pool don't support it. So basically Synapse doesn't support it. So you'll have to write a similar statement to what we did previously, but this time we'll be using the object ID to find out whether the object already exists, and then you can drop it if it already exists. So let's do that. So I'm going to do if. And then I'm going to specify the object ID. And let's look for our table. So that'll be the bronze.taxi zone. And I'm going to say is not null. So we tried to get the object ID of this. And if it is not null, then we want to drop it. So what that means is actually the table already exists. I'm going to just drop the table. So that would be a drop external table. And then you just carry on. So in this case, what would happen is if the table already exists, that statement is going to drop the table and then it gets created. If it doesn't exist, then that statement is not going to be executed. It'll still get a success. So that's what we want. So let's run this through. And that's brilliant. So the scripts run through the tables created with the new file format and the rejection options. We now need to think about how to test this because our file doesn't have any invalid data. So what I'm going to do is to make changes to the data types here so that actually it makes the records coming in as invalid records. For example, let's go for the borough from 15 characters to, say, 1 character. So that means these are not going to fit into that size and they're going to fail. So let's run that through and see what happens. So if I run the whole script again, it should drop and recreate the table, which it has done. And also, as you can see there, it says the query completed with errors. So we got no data here. And if I click on messages, it's going to tell me that actually the maximum reject threshold has reached. But the interesting thing will be is to look at the rejected records and the reasons in our storage account because we have pointed that into the location here. Let's go to that. I'm going to use Storage Explorer here and they got all the rejection under the NYC taxi data container. And within that, as you can see, we got a new folder called rejections and let me go into that and we got the taxi zone folder here as expected and the Synapse serverless has created the folder for us which is the _ rejected rows. And within that, as you can see, we've got the folders with the date and the time and also the statement ID. So we got 2 folders here. The top one doesn't have any rejected records. That's because the query succeeded at that time without any errors. But if you go into the next folder, you're going to have the rejected records here. So we got 2 files. One is row.csv, which is going to have the rejected records, and the other file, which is the error.json, which is going to have the information about exactly what made the records to be invalid. So let's download these 2 files and then open up in another browser. So I'm going to use the Visual Studio Code to open those up so we can examine the data there. And let me open both of them in Visual Studio Code. And as you can see here, we've got the rejected trackers. So we have got 11 records here. That's because the value you can specify goes from 0 onwards. So if it is 0, when you hit the first rejected record, it'll fail and it'll write the first rejected record here. But in this case, actually, it goes up to 10. When it sees the 11th rejected record, it fails. And 11th one is also written here. That's why you've got 11 records here. And we've got another file. As you can see, the error.json, which gives a bit more information. Let me format the file and then we can see a bit more information. As you can see here, we've got the actual error message, which is bulk load data conversion error, which is truncation. As you can see, we've had the values EWR, but the field only accepted 1 character. So that is a truncation error. And similarly, you're going to see all of those and it's got the file name that caused the issue and also you've got the column name as well. So the file name is quite useful when you have external to say a table sitting on a folder rather than a file. And you've got multiple files within that and also you've got the column name which will be quite useful for you as well. And it's given us all of the information. It tells you even the row within the file itself as well. So you've got all of the good information that we need in order to investigate the issue. So let's now go back to our Synapse Studio and make the change so that actually the code is still valid. So the table is still valid and let me rerun that as well. So when we come to use this table, we are not going to have this issue again. So I hope you've got a good understanding about how to handle rejections here. And that's the end of this session. I'll see you in the next one.